We left off in Acts 27 when Paul, as a prisoner, was leaving leaving Cyprus, and he was headed to Rome. They were headed to Rome, and in the process, he anticipated this due to the season, that there would be a big storm that would potentially really threaten the ship and the lives upon the ship and the voyage. And he mentioned to the sailors that this is not the best time to leave. And they said, oh, it's fine. And I'm sure they had interests in their money and their cargo and making deadlines and all this stuff. So they went anyway. And as it turned out, there was a nor'easter, equivalent to a nor'easter, that swept up, and a very fierce storm that ends up shipwrecking them. And we'll read about this more. I don't know how far we got into it. I'm pretty sure we left off in verse 27. And I'd like to hopefully try to finish this book today. It'd be a good place to break. Alright, but I guess I can start back up a little bit into verse 13. So we'll start in Acts 27, verse 13. And it says, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, that is, of having favorable winds, putting out to sea, they sailed close to Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind, called basically a nor'easter is another translation for that, it arose. So when the ship was caught in this wind and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. So they let the ship just take its natural course according to the wind instead of trying to fight it so much. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables and undergirded the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our hands. That's when you know that things are they're starting to get bad, when people are willing to part with a lot of their goods, and in favor of saving their own life. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. But after a long absence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete, and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. So he's making a prediction here. The Spirit apparently revealed to him that if everybody did what he said, then no loss of life would be incurred, but only that the ship would be lost. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God whom I belong, and whom I serve, and saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. I'm sure Paul prayed for everybody, and God said through this angel that your prayer has been answered and no life will be lost. Verse 25, therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it would be just as it was told to me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Verse 27, I believe this is where we left off. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near to some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. All right, so just as a little recap here, they're taking soundings, and I believe the way that they did this back then, and Bob might know more than me, I believe they would strike a piece, they'd put something in the water and they'd strike a piece of wood or strike the side of the ship and made a noise that went down, and is that right?
I don't know about that. I mean, you would think that they would have some kind of a rope with markings on it with a heavy ballast stone, and it would drop down, and they'd probably watch the markings on the rope and see how deep, and then pull it back up again.
That's called taking soundings?
I think that's how I perceived it.
And that might be right. I'm not 100%
Back
sure.
then, at least.
But they had ways of doing these things and taking measurements of how deep the water was. I believe it was about 90 feet, which is what this equates to. And what about the skiff? What's the skiff? Do you know what the skiff is?
Like a lifeboat?
Anybody have another translation? What is this? Lifeboat. Okay. All right, verse 33. All right, so they cut the anchors loose. Okay, they had 4 anchors that they cut loose, which will be important in a few minutes. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have waited and continued without food, and eating nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. So he kind of made an example of how he prayed before he ate and thanked the God of heaven, the God of Israel. Verse 36, then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were about 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Remember, this whole ship was carrying loads of grain, and they tossed that over too. Verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors, I guess here's where they let go the anchors, and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow struck fast and remained immovable. So they hit, a sandbar. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves, and the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to the land. So they ran aground onto a sandbar, the ship was being torn apart, and I guess they had some people swim to the shore, and they didn't recognize where they were, but they did let the anchors down and let them go into the sea. Now, chapter 28, we're going to stop in a second and look at something. Now, when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta. That is, they did not immediately recognize where they were. They were on an unfamiliar side of the island. I'm sure that they've seen Malta before, but probably from the other side, where the shipping routes would go. But there's some interesting background here that, Paul is going to be introduced to the people of Malta, which some translations say are natives or whatever. That just means non-Greeks. And the people, Paul, you'll see, gets introduced to a bunch of these people, and his impact on Malta was profound. Malta has now the greatest population of Christians anywhere in Europe. It's like 98% claim to be Christian, and they have churches everywhere and remembrances of Paul everywhere. This event had a significant impact on Malta. So he was definitely there. But that Bob Cornuke, the guy that did the real Mount Sinai video, also set out to find the shipwreck of Paul. And they believe they found the 4 anchors that were part of this shipwreck. And it's everything that it mentions here, all the points that would identify where they landed, is not the traditional site. It's on the back side of the island instead of this one other port, that place that the people kind of remember where it was, according to their legends. So we'll watch this little video. This is really good. I think you guys like this. This is more just confirmation that these are real events. I'm going to turn this way up.
PJ, is it all up? PJ, yeah, so we can see.
Here we go.
You can go right to there. Oh, I know, that's true. You know what?
It was sometime around 60 AD, and the Apostle Paul was en route to Rome from the Isle of Crete. On the journey, a fierce storm blew the ship off course.
On the 14th night, it was still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea.
With the storm still raging, the ship struck a sandbar and began to break apart. The nearly 300 men on board swam for their lives. Miraculously, everyone survived.
Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta.
And so began
below
the Christian
Sicily.
influence in Malta that has continued down through the centuries. Today, Malta is Europe's most religious nation. 98% of its citizens are Catholic. St. Paul is memorialized across the island, nowhere more than in St. Paul's Bay, where tourists come to visit the shipwrecked cathedral and see the spot where most believe Paul's ship ran aground nearly 2,000 years ago. But when former Los Angeles crime scene investigator Bob Cornuke paid a visit to Malta, facts in the biblical narrative didn't fit with the view from St. Paul's Bay. That difference led to a 10-year search for the true location of Paul's shipwreck. Bob started in the pages of his Bible. The crux of the story revolved around the 4 anchors. Could they be found?
And I looked at the Bible and said, could I solve this like it was a crime? Could I take the evidence that exists on the pages of the Bible and actually find these lost anchors that the Bible talks about?
Acts 27 and 28 gives a very detailed account, so Bob listed 4 factors that would have to match up in order to find the true location. A bay with a beach, a reef with a sandbar where 2 seas meet, the seabed at about 90 feet of depth, and a place the sailors would not have recognized. Cornuke enlisted the help of a group of men who know the waters around Malta best, the Maltese fishermen.
So what I did is I started my search by going out with these fishermen that knew the weather, knew the currents, knew the topography of the ocean. They took me out with them and they explained to me all the possible places based on what the Bible narrative says to where the shipwreck of Paul could have been.
Most of Malta is surrounded by cliffs, so Bob quickly narrowed down the possibilities to a few bays with beaches. To figure out which site was most plausible, Cornuke looked to Dr. Graham Hutt, an expert on Mediterranean storms.
I've been studying the storms and the weather patterns in the Mediterranean over the past 30 years. It resulted in a book on North Africa and Malta, which covers all these issues with the weather.
Dr. Hutt's expertise helped make sense of the clues in Acts.
They were really scared of getting dragged down into the Bay of Circe, down on the Libyan coast. So they would have been trying as much as they could.
7 and 28. Now, part of the biblical account says that the sailors didn't recognize the island and didn't know where they were until the villagers told them that this was Malta. And that is another support for the theory that this was the bay that they landed in, because if the sailors had landed on the north side of the island, there were many ports that they should have been familiar with. One day, Bob made an electrifying discovery. It came by way of an old diver with an incredible story.
I met a man named Ray Chancho, and he said, hey, Bob, in the late 60s and early 70s, we dug up 4 anchors from the ocean bottom at about 90 feet depth.
The location? Just outside St. Thomas Bay, near a dangerous sandbar called the Muchar Reef. The anchors were later donated to the National Maritime Museum. An expert analysis confirmed that they were from the Roman era, but the divers had no idea what they had at the time.
We found the anchors at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. I only remember the exact year, you know. As I said, it was of no importance to me whatsoever. It was DP, we found a piece of wood.
Ray agreed to show us the area where the anchors were found.
Coming out to the head of Muchar Reef. We're going to dive down and see if we can find the site where the anchors were brought up.
So when I went out and looked at the location where they found these anchors, I looked at the shoreline and it fit with what the Bible said. There was a bay with a beach. There was a reef where 2 seas come together.
Today, the seafloor is again tranquil and calm, giving no clues to the secrets that lie beneath the waves. It's impossible to know for sure if this is the spot where Paul's shipwreck occurred, but many Maltese are intrigued by the theory. Joe Navarro is another of the divers who helped retrieve the anchors.
I myself am convinced that it is more plausible that the shipwreck was on Muchar, not on St. Paul's Island. We have believed St. Paul's Island, but nobody ever sort of questioned, but are you sure?
We looked down at this glistening anchor, and I remember kneeling down and putting my hand on that cold object and thinking that I could be now touching history. For 2,000 years it belonged to the sea, and now I was actually touching this object that could come to us from the pages of the Bible.
Today, the anchors are tucked away in a corner of Valletta's Maritime Museum. Most visitors pass them by, having no idea what history they might hold. Chuck Holt, CBN News, on the Mediterranean Isle of Malta.
I think there's an entire book about it too that you can get. Analogy to some of the scripture stories make them kind of come alive and show that this stuff really did happen, and there is evidence of these things if people go out and look for them. So Paul's shipwreck. They end up on Malta. We'll start in chapter 28 again, we'll pick it up. Alright, so when they escaped, they found out from the inhabitants there, the villagers, that the island was called Malta. And these natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made all of us welcome, because the rain that was falling and because of the cold. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, who, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow him to live." But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So we went from a murderer to a god in their estimation. And this is interesting, what kind of a snake latched itself onto Paul. And from this, the lore of Malta is that there's no more venomous snakes in Malta. But there are still some venomous snakes there. Some of the snakes, the local snakes that they do have, they have leopard snakes, which are non-venomous. They have a black whip snake, which is not venomous, but gets to it's a long, slender snake. They have the Algerian whip snake, which is mildly venomous, which it could have been one of those, I suppose, because they are rear-fanged, I believe, and they would, tend to hang on. There's also the cat snake, which is like a relative of the mangrove snake. If you've ever seen one of those, they're black with yellow rings. But the cat snake that would be there would not be those colors, but it's related. It is another rear-fanged venomous snake. Or it could have been what they call a blunt-nosed viper. And blunt-nosed vipers are from all around that area. Now, are they on Malta now? I mean, maybe, but people are not familiar with them being there at this point. But they certainly could have been. There were trade ships going from... They're found all through Africa. They're found on, I believe, Crete. They're in Europe there. So it's very possible it could have been what they call a Libertine viper or a blunt-nosed viper. In any case, it's and you'll hear. Anyway, it was probably one of these type of snakes. Whether venomous or not, the people perceived that what bit him was a venomous snake and that it should have killed him. But this kind of semi-relates to Acts chapter 6, Mark 16. Jesus' reference to things like venomous snakes not harming them. Sort of a near fulfillment of that. Not exactly what we see in the Pentecostal churches, those snake-handling churches of today. So, let's see. Just moving on. So he lived from this, and it obviously gained their immediate respect. And Paul used the occasion to preach, no doubt. It says, verse 7, "In that region there was an estate of a leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Dysentery, thank you. Paul went in to pray for him, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had disease also came and were healed. They also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided such things as were necessary." So they gave them food and supplies and the means to leave. So it was a big event, and like I said, it obviously affected them profoundly, even to this day. Verse 11, "After 3 months we sailed in an Alexandrian ship, whose figurehead was the twin brothers, which had wintered at the island." Now, before I continue, this is just a reminder that, bad things happen to us, and things that are inconveniences, and instead of becoming exceedingly upset by them, and having all frustration, why did this have to happen, and yada, 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 and just having this type of frustration, God can use any of these inconveniences and detours for His good. And it obviously turned out very good that he did shipwreck there. I mean, nobody's lives were lost, and God used it. God used the entire situation to affect this island below Sicily for centuries, even millennia. So keep that in mind as things happen in life. You get a flat tire, you get sidetracked somehow, some terrible things happen. Even look at the life of St. Patrick, or most of these people we consider, heroes of the faith, that, bad things happen to us, but let's let God use them for good and make the best of every situation and always be thankful. All right, so verse 17. Verse 17, and it came to pass after 3 days that Paul called the leaders of the Jews together. So when they had come together, he said to them, Men and brethren, though I have done nothing against your people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, wanted to let me go, because there was no cause for putting me to death. And that's true, that's exactly what they said. They said if he had not appealed to Rome, he would have been let go. But when the Jews spoke against it, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had anything of which to accuse my neighbor.